When was the last time you let yourself really imagine? Not a quick daydream between meetings, not a passing thought about what life could look like if things were different. I mean, really imagine, fully, deliberately, with every sense engaged, as if the thing you wanted was already real, already yours, already the life you were living. If you're like most people, the honest answer is never. Or at least not since you were a child, before the world taught you that imagination was something you're supposed to grow out of. And according to Neville Goddard, that is the single most expensive mistake a human being can make. So to kick off this deep dive, I want to take you to New York City. Neville Goddard is a lecturer, unknown outside a pretty small circle, performing to modest crowds, teaching ideas so radical that most people who hear them walk away convinced he's either a genius or completely out of his mind. But at this specific moment, the spring of 1943, Neville is in the United States Army, drafted, stationed at a large camp in Louisiana, going nowhere. Not because he's a coward, but because he has work to do, lectures to give, a message he genuinely believes the world needs to hear, and the US Army has absolutely no interest in any of that. His commanding officer explicitly disapproves his application for an honorable discharge. Bureaucratically, it's over, he's stuck. But then he does something that by every rational measure simply should not work. He goes to his cot at night in the barracks, closes his eyes and imagines, with complete sensory vividness, with total emotional conviction, that he is at home in his own apartment in New York City. He's not wishing he was there, not hoping. He physically feels the familiar weight of his own bed. He sees the pavement and the trees outside his specific window. He inhabits the scene so completely that the army, the barracks, the war, it all dissolves. He does this for 8 nights. On the 9th morning, defying all bureaucratic logic, that exact same commanding officer calls him in, completely reverses his own decision, and honorably discharges him. Neville walks out of the army, gets on a train, and never looks back. Now, you can hear that story and decide it's a coincidence. A lucky break dressed up as a mystical experience, that's a natural reaction. But the core mission of today's deep dive is to ask the really terrifying, exhilarating question: what if it wasn't a coincidence? What if imagination is the actual literal cause of reality? To even entertain that, we have to look at a philosophy that demands a complete reversal of how we perceive the physical world. For this deep dive, we're drawing from a fascinating stack of sources, primarily excerpts from Neville Goddard's foundational texts. But to ground it, we're also exploring the historical context of his teacher, a mysterious, eccentric Ethiopian rabbi named Abdullah. And perhaps most importantly, we're pulling from modern practitioners like Missy Renee and Anna. Because here's what I really want to focus on: the transition from the mystical to the practical. If Neville's discharge wasn't just some freak bureaucratic glitch, then our entire culturally accepted definition of the word imagination is completely flawed. We treat it like a passive biological quirk, the sandbox we put kids in to keep them entertained. In a corporate meeting, if someone pitches an unrealistic timeline, a manager might say, "Well, that's just pure imagination," which means disconnected from reality. We view imagination as a mirror that reflects a distorted version of the real world. But Neville says the opposite. He says imagination is not a mirror. It is the projector. It is not reflecting reality. It is actively generating it. The unseen internal world is the only true reality, and this physical world we're sitting in is merely the delayed shadow of our imaginal acts. So here's a challenge. What if your imagination isn't a theater at all? What if it's actually the control room? What if the things you're idly picturing, the anxieties you rehearse, the arguments you win in the shower, are actually being programmed into the physical world? This assigns a terrifying weight to every passing thought. Now, I know exactly what the cynical reaction to this is. If my imagination creates reality and I'm the programmer in the control room, why isn't there $1 million on my desk right now? Millions of people sit in rush hour traffic, vividly picturing themselves walking onto a private jet. They feel the joy, and it produces nothing. They wake up and get right back in their Honda Civic. That failure is the perfect entry point. It comes down to a crucial distinction taught to Neville by Abdullah, an eccentric teacher of Moorish mysticism. Kabbalah has a very strict architecture. The physical world, Malkuth, is the lowest emanation, the densest, slowest realm. You cannot change the physical world by manipulating the physical world. It's like trying to change your reflection by drawing on the mirror with a marker. You have to change the higher, unseen levels of consciousness first. Abdullah was handing him an ancient cosmology where the physical world is the caboose of the train, not the engine. And from that came the single most important operational distinction: the difference between thinking of your desires and thinking from the end. When you're daydreaming about the lottery, you're observing wealth as an object separate from you. That state of yearning? It's literally a state of lack. Your imagination projects exactly what you're feeling, the feeling of not having it. Abdullah taught that you must assume the state of the wish already fulfilled. You don't visualize the journey. You must mentally, emotionally, and physically inhabit the space of already being the person who has the result. Think of it this way. You're not sitting in the back row watching the movie happen. You're stepping onto the set, realizing you're the lead actor, and the scene is already in progress. Because the person who already has $1 million doesn't sit in traffic desperately wishing for $1 million. They think from a baseline of security, it just feels normal to them. We have a beautifully documented story from 1933. Neville is in New York during the Great Depression, completely destitute. He has an overwhelming desire to go home to Barbados for the winter, not a dime to his name. A transatlantic journey during the Great Depression with $0. The physical facts are screaming that this is impossible, so Neville goes to Abdullah, expecting a manifestation ritual or a strategy to get the money. Instead, Abdullah tells him, if you will imagine yourself to be in Barbados, thinking and viewing the world from that state of consciousness instead of thinking of Barbados, you will spend the winter there. And then he just sends him on his way. Abdullah instructs Neville to go to his apartment in New York, get into his bed, and fall asleep assuming he is physically sleeping in his mother's house in Barbados. He didn't tell him to visualize a boat ticket. He told him to geographically relocate his consciousness, feel the specific climate of the Caribbean, smell the salt air, see the exact streets of his childhood neighborhood outside the window. And here is where the strictness of the method really becomes apparent. The next day, Neville goes back to Abdullah and tries to discuss his physical reality. He says, "Ab, I imagined it, but I still don't have any money for the ticket. How is this actually going to happen?" The natural panic of the rational mind setting in. The rent is due, the bank is empty, and he's pretending to be on an island. Abdullah's reaction was extraordinary. He literally slammed the door in Neville's face. He refused to even entertain the conversation. He shouted through the door, "Who is talking about going to Barbados? You are already in Barbados." Abdullah understood that the exact moment Neville began questioning the how, he had fallen out of the state of the wish fulfilled. He had mentally returned to New York. He had broken the assumption. So Abdullah forced a psychological lockdown. Neville was not allowed to acknowledge his poverty. He had to stay fiercely, stubbornly loyal to the unseen reality of Barbados, completely ignoring the physical evidence of New York. And according to the historical record, shortly after this period of intense forced assumption, Neville receives an unexpected letter from his brother containing a boat ticket and $50, and Neville sails to Barbados for the winter. The physical world eventually contoured to the psychological reality he had stubbornly maintained. Now, the rationalist in me wants to pause and analyze the mechanics here. Did Neville's intense focus just subtly alter his behavior? Maybe it prompted him to write a letter to his brother that he otherwise wouldn't have written, which then triggered the gift. That's a perfectly logical explanation. Or is it something more profound? To understand why thinking from the end is supposed to actually alter the physical world, we have to dig into the philosophical bedrock Neville built this system upon, and it is a deeply controversial worldview. It requires a massive leap, and it's the aspect of his teachings that most modern manifestation summaries completely sanitize or skip over, because it makes people profoundly uncomfortable. Neville's entire system is built upon a highly unorthodox, radical reinterpretation of the Bible. He was heavily influenced by the English Romantic poet and mystic William Blake, a visionary who rejected the Enlightenment era's obsession with pure reason. Blake wrote that man is all imagination, that God is man and exists in us and we in him. He believed the rational mind was a restrictive cage and the imagination was the literal presence of the divine. So how did Neville map Blake's poetic vision onto the Bible? Because reading the Bible as a textbook for reality creation is a massive departure from standard theology. Neville argued that humanity has completely misunderstood the Bible by reading it as secular history. He proposed that the Bible is entirely a psychological drama, a blueprint of the evolution of human consciousness, taking place entirely within the mind of the individual reader. He claimed it is not a historical document, not a biography of ancient kings and prophets, not a record of physical events in the Middle East. So when he reads about Moses, David, or Abraham, he isn't reading about men who lived thousands of years ago. He views every character, every geographic location, every event as a personification of the laws and functions of the mind. And the most radical, foundational part of this interpretation is his definition of God. Neville completely rejected the orthodox concept of God as an external, separate deity, what he mockingly described as an aged senior with a beard capriciously pulling strings in some far-off corner of the universe. Instead, he posited that God is human awareness. God is the fundamental human consciousness, the phrase I am. When the biblical text says, I am the door, or I am the resurrection and the life, Neville interprets that as your own fundamental, formless awareness of being, speaking directly to you. He goes even further, identifying the figure of Christ in the Gospels as the human imagination itself. The crucifixion is the imagination descending into the physical body. The resurrection is the imagination awakening to its true creative power. If you're encountering this for the very first time, this is either total blasphemy or the most empowering concept imaginable. There really is no middle ground. But let's look at the implications if we adopt this framework. It means we are the landlords of our own consciousness, not helpless tenants subject to the whims of the external world. We don't have to just sit there and accept the terrible furniture of our current reality. If consciousness is the sole creator, then the physical world is simply a mirror reflecting our internal states. The circumstances of your life, your bank account, your relationships, your health, they are the delayed shadow of your internal assumptions. Now, that's a beautiful sentiment, but I need to understand the plumbing. How does the shadow actually get cast? Because in Feeling is the Secret, Neville gets incredibly specific about the mechanics of this creation. He doesn't leave it at vague mysticism. He actually maps the cognitive process using the conscious and subconscious mind. He describes the conscious mind as the gatekeeper, the interface with the physical world. It operates through the 5 senses, filled with logic, reason, deduction, and most importantly, limiting beliefs. Its primary job is to look at the physical world, gather data, and say, this is what is real and this is what is impossible. The conscious mind is the accountant looking at the spreadsheet. It sees the bank account, sees $20, and concludes, we cannot go to Barbados. It is inherently bound by current facts. The subconscious mind, on the other hand, is the builder, the vast, deep, creative engine. But here's the critical limitation. The subconscious cannot reason. It doesn't argue. It has no capacity for logic. It simply accepts whatever the conscious mind deeply impresses upon it as absolute truth, and then it relentlessly sets about creating that truth in the physical world. Here's a metaphor I find really useful. Think of the conscious mind as a massive, stubborn bouncer standing outside an exclusive VIP club. The bouncer has a clipboard of hard physical facts. He represents our evolutionary biology. He's there to keep us safe. If I imagine I can fly, the bouncer looks at gravity, says no, and stops me from jumping off a building. Very useful for survival, terrible for creation. Because the subconscious mind is the VIP section inside that club, a team of infinite architects ready to build whatever blueprint you hand them. The problem is the bouncer keeps blocking the instructions. If I try to hand him a blueprint that says I have $1 million, he looks at my checking account, laughs in my face, and throws the blueprint in the trash. The subconscious never even gets the message. This is why just standing in front of a mirror shouting, I am a millionaire while fully awake, doesn't work. The conscious mind will say, That is a lie, and you know it. It triggers cognitive dissonance, and the whole thing collapses. The entire practical application of Neville's work is therefore based on one single tactical objective: bypassing that bouncer. So how do we actually slip past him and get the blueprint to the architects? The primary method Neville developed is what he called the state akin to sleep, commonly abbreviated in modern communities as SATS. And we have excellent modern context on this from practitioner Missy Renee. She explains that SATS relies on taking strategic advantage of the hypnagogic threshold, that twilight transitional state of consciousness directly before you fall asleep at night. You're not fully asleep. You're not fully unconscious. You still have the agency to direct your thoughts, but you're no longer fully alert. Your body feels heavy, perhaps a bit floaty. The sharp edges of the physical world begin to blur. It's that very specific window where your thoughts start drifting into dream logic. But if a car backfires outside, you still know you're in your own bed. Why is this window the holy grail for this technique? Missy Renee points to the neuroscience. In this twilight state, your brain waves are shifting from fast, alert beta waves down into relaxed alpha and eventually theta waves. During this shift, the prefrontal cortex, the bouncer, is effectively powering down for the night. The logic and the limiting beliefs go dormant, but the subconscious mind is wide open, highly suggestible, and completely receptive. We are essentially waiting for the bouncer to go on his lunch break. The door to the VIP section is left unguarded. The rational mind is too tired to argue, so we can finally slip the new blueprint directly to the construction crew. Neville describes it beautifully. Sleep conceals the creative act while the objective world reveals it. But this is where most people fail, because it's not just passively daydreaming as you drift off. It requires immense, focused, directed attention. This is the concept of sensory vividness, because if the subconscious doesn't understand language or logic, how does it actually read the blueprint? It reads feelings and senses. This isn't about visualizing a static, two-dimensional picture of what you want. Visualization is actually a poor word for it. Neville emphasizes the necessity of spiritual sensation. To impress the subconscious, you must construct a short, highly specific scene that implies your wish has already been fulfilled. And crucially, the scene must be an event that would naturally occur after you have succeeded, not the process of succeeding. Then you loop that short scene over and over in your mind. Think of it like a 5-second GIF. You aren't directing a feature-length film where your mind can wander. You are looping a very tight, controlled action. And with each loop, you layer in sensory details. If you're imagining a promotion at work, don't visualize yourself working hard at your desk. Visualize the moment you are shaking your manager's hand after the promotion has been announced. On the first loop, focus on the visual. On the second loop, add the tactile sensation. Feel the physical solidity, the warmth, the pressure of their hand in yours. On the third loop, add the auditory. Hear the exact distinct tone of their voice saying, "Congratulations on the new role, you earned this." You build the reality layer by layer through simulated senses. There's a literary concept that connects deeply to this: Samuel Taylor Coleridge's suspension of disbelief. Coleridge coined the term to explain how a reader can enjoy a fantastical poem or piece of fiction by willingly choosing to ignore the unreality of the narrative. Neville repurposes this concept entirely for reality creation. When you are lying in your bed looping the scene, your physical senses are going to try to interrupt you. You might feel the lumpy mattress under your back, just like Neville felt the rigid army cot in Louisiana. Your conscious mind might weakly protest. You aren't shaking your boss's hand, you're in bed, the bouncer trying to wake back up. You have to exercise the discipline to willingly suspend your disbelief in your imaginal act. You must aggressively push out the physical facts of your bedroom until the imaginal scene takes on all the tones and textures of reality. You have to give the unseen scene the absolute quality of isness. Neville describes that when you execute this correctly, the transition back to the physical waking world should be a genuine shock. You should open your eyes and momentarily be disoriented that you are in your bed, because you were so completely absorbed and anchored in the imaginal state. Your brain should not be able to tell the difference between the physical world and the imaginal act. So we've established the theoretical framework and the nightly technique. Get drowsy, bypass the analytical bouncer, loop a sensory-rich scene of the end result, and feel it as an established fact. But no deep dive is complete without examining the empirical evidence. The source material provides actual case histories that Neville documented, concrete stories of people who applied this exact method to seemingly impossible physical barriers. Let's examine 3 of these cases in detail to see how the mechanics hold up under pressure. The first case, the apartment building. This case involves a doctor and his wife. They owned an empty commercial lot next to their medical clinic and had a burning desire to build an apartment building on that space to generate passive income. The problem was entirely financial. In physical, 3-dimensional reality, they simply had no money to build a multi-story apartment complex. The rational bouncer is looking at the ledger and saying, construction requires capital. We do not have capital. Therefore, construction is impossible. But they attend Neville's lectures, learn the SATS technique, and decide to completely ignore the financial barrier. They begin by physically drawing up architectural plans as a focusing tool. But the real work happens in SATS. Every night, they go into the hypnagogic state and take imaginary first-person tours through the completed, fully occupied building. They don't imagine looking for a loan. They imagine walking down the finished hallways. They rent out specific units to imaginary tenants. They cultivate the deep emotional pride of ownership. They added a specific sensory anchor. They brought a friend into their imaginal scene, a woman referred to as Mrs. X, who hadn't spoken to them in some time because she thought their interest in mysticism was ridiculous. In their SATS loop, they imagined taking Mrs. X on a grand tour of the finished building. At the end of the tour, they clearly and vividly heard her voice say, "Doctor, I think it is beautiful." They isolated a specific auditory sensation and looped it until it felt like a memory. Weeks go by in the physical world. Nothing changes. Then, seemingly at random, the wife notices a contractor's sign on a different building project in town and mentions it to her husband. They reach out. The contractor comes over, looks at their architectural plans, and is so impressed by the design and the location that he volunteers to finance the entire construction project himself. He fronts the money. The doctor and his wife put $0 down. The building is constructed exactly as they had imagined it. And then, the epilogue. A month after completion, Mrs. X unexpectedly drops by to re-establish contact. They give her a physical tour of the building. At the end of the tour, she stops, turns to the doctor, and delivers the exact words, with the exact intonation they had rehearsed in their minds for weeks. "Doctor, I think it is beautiful." Now, skeptics will point to the reticular activating system, the RAS, the network of neurons in the brainstem that acts as a filter, prioritizing information based on what you focus on. The argument being that by constantly visualizing the building, they simply primed their RAS to notice the contractor's sign, which they would have otherwise ignored. The psychological focus just changed their behavior. A mystic would argue that the subconscious mind arranged the quantum probability of the contractor being in the right place at the right time. But honestly, regardless of whether you view it through the lens of cognitive filtering or quantum manifestation, the result is identical. The intense assumption of the end state bypassed the obstacle of the how. The second case tests the limits of this technique under extreme emotional duress. A woman was being sued by a real estate broker for $1,500, a devastating sum at the time. Her personal life was in shambles. Her husband was hospitalized. She had no witnesses to corroborate her side of the story, and the broker arrived in court with 3 aggressive attorneys. The power dynamic in that room was completely skewed against her. Her own attorney took her aside before the proceedings and told her flatly that they had absolutely no chance of winning. The law was stringent. The judge's early remarks seemed to heavily favor the plaintiff. The physical facts were entirely against her. But instead of succumbing to the panic, she applied the SATS technique, right there in the courtroom. This is a crucial detail. She didn't wait until she was safely in bed in a dark room. She had to bypass the bouncer while sitting directly in the chaos with the lights blaring. She closed her eyes, turned her consciousness inward, and focused entirely on the end result she desired. She tuned out the trial. In her imagination, she repeatedly listened to the jury foreman say a single sentence: "We find the defendant not guilty." She looped that audio, blocking out the actual courtroom until it felt completely true and inevitable. The psychological discipline required to do that is staggering. The amygdala is screaming threat, and she is calmly looping an auditory image of victory. The jury deliberated for hours. Throughout the deliberation, she maintained the internal state. When the jury finally returned, the foreman stood up and delivered the exact verdict she had been hearing internally for hours. "We find the defendant not guilty." She didn't argue the mechanics of the case. She simply occupied the state of the exonerated person. The third case moves from legal jeopardy into biological jeopardy, and it is perhaps the most visceral of all. This case centers on a woman who was entirely bedridden. She suffered from a severe blood clot condition, hardening of the arteries, acute arthritis, and an enlarged thyroid. Her physical deterioration was immense. She described her body from her hips to her toes as feeling like it was encased in tight, unyielding wires. She could not place her feet on the floor without the aid of heavy, elastic stockings. Her doctors had exhausted their options. She was despondent. The physical evidence of her reality was constant, excruciating pain, and pain is the ultimate anchor to three-dimensional reality. The catalyst was a postcard. A friend sent her a postcard depicting a beautiful, vibrant ocean beach. She looked at the image and it triggered deep, joyous childhood memories of running freely on the sand. As she lay in bed, physically unable to move, she decided to animate that static picture in her mind using sats. She didn't just look at the beach, she inhabited it. She felt the heavy impact of her bare feet against the hard, wet sand. She felt the icy shock of the ocean water rushing over her toes. She heard the deafening crash of the waves. She imagined herself running with absolute freedom and physical power, completely replacing the sensation of the painful wires with the sensation of the icy water. She did this persistently, day after day, for a week, completely losing herself in the joy of that physical sensation, entirely ignoring the medical prognosis. The result was rapid and inexplicable to her physicians. The physical sensation of the wires began to disappear. The swelling in her legs subsided. She was out of bed, walking freely without the stockings, and her doctors were completely baffled by the spontaneous remission of her symptoms. This case is where Neville's material intersects intensely with modern psychosomatic research, specifically the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, who is referenced in our source material. His research focuses on neuroplasticity and epigenetics, the idea that the brain literally does not know the difference between a vividly imagined event and a real physical event. When that woman was looping the sensation of running on the beach, her brain was firing the exact same neural pathways as if she were actually running. It was signaling her body to release the neurochemistry of joy and physical exertion, completely overriding the stress chemistry of cortisol and inflammation that the disease was producing. By inhabiting the state of health in her imagination, she forced her physical biology to align with that state. Powerful stuff. But this brings us to a massive roadblock, and I can hear it already. I understand the theory. I've tried visualizing. I've tried feeling the end. But it just doesn't work for me. What if your current reality, or your past trauma, is simply too loud, too heavy, too deeply ingrained to ignore? What if every time you close your eyes and try to imagine a beach, your brain just screams at you about overdue bills or the weight of a painful past? This leads us to the most advanced, and honestly the most morally weighty, part of this entire summary. The section that nobody covers in the quick, shiny summaries of manifestation, because this is where it gets really deep. To understand why the law seems to fail for so many people, we look at an essay written by Israel Regardie, a prominent occultist and student of Neville in the 1940s. Regardie keenly observed that in every single lecture Neville gave, there was always a small, disgruntled group of students who simply could not get the SATS technique to work. They would try it, fail, get angry, and denounce Neville as a fraud. So why did it work so effortlessly for Neville, and fail so spectacularly for them? Modern practitioner Anna provides a brilliant analysis of this. She points to a crucial biographical detail. Neville Goddard came from a deeply loving, supportive family in Barbados. He had an idyllic childhood. His mother, in particular, instilled a profound, unshakable sense of self-worth in him. Neville naturally possessed a very high self-concept. His subconscious was already primed for success. His internal bouncer was quite relaxed when it came to accepting good things. He already believed, at a deep subconscious level, that he was inherently worthy of the things he was imagining. But many of his students, and a vast percentage of the population today, carry deep, unresolved childhood traumas. Their formative years heavily impressed their subconscious minds with core beliefs of unworthiness, danger, scarcity, or abandonment. If your subconscious is hardwired with the fundamental belief that you are perpetually unsafe, and you try to consciously imagine a scenario of ultimate freedom or wealth, it's like trying to build a mansion on a foundation of rotten wood. The cognitive dissonance is simply too great. Anna uses a perfect metaphor for this. She says that using positive affirmations or visualizations when you have deep, unexamined limiting beliefs is like mowing a lawn that is completely infested with weeds. You cut the tops off and the lawn looks pristine for a day or two. You feel great, but you haven't touched the root system. The roots are still entangled deep in the soil, and within a week, the weeds grow back stronger than before. So how do you pull out the roots? How do you change a subconscious that was programmed by trauma 20 years ago? Later in his career, Neville recognized this exact roadblock and introduced his ultimate, and arguably most difficult, psychological technique, the pruning shears of revision. Revision. This is where the philosophy borders on psychological time travel. Practitioner Anna utilized this technique to systematically revise over 100 childhood memories. Here's how it actually works. Revision is essentially the SATS technique, but applied to the past instead of the future. The foundational premise is this: if your current three-dimensional reality is merely a reflection of your subconscious beliefs, and your subconscious beliefs were formed by traumatic past events, then you have to retroactively change the past. Not the objective historical facts of what occurred, but how your subconscious remembers it happening. You alter the emotional signature of the memory. You literally rewrite personal history inside your own mind to reprogram the current software. Anna provides a profound hypothetical that mirrors the work she actually did. Imagine you were physically struck by a caregiver during your childhood. That single event created a deep, radiating subconscious belief that you are fundamentally unsafe, that people who love you will hurt you, and that the world is dangerous. That is a massive weed. Every relationship you have as an adult is filtered through that root system. To use the pruning shears of revision on this, you isolate that specific memory. First, you acknowledge how it made you feel, utterly unsafe and unprotected. Next, you identify the exact opposite emotional state, the feeling of being completely safe, fiercely protected, and valued. Finally, you write a completely new alternative scenario for that exact moment in time, a scenario that would naturally produce that feeling of safety. For example, instead of the caregiver striking you, you imagine a stranger threatening you, and your caregiver furiously steps in, banishes the threat, and holds you close, fiercely protecting you. You construct a narrative of ultimate safety. Then you enter the meditative, drowsy state of ersatz, and you play out the new scene in your imagination, in first person, with all the sensory details, the warmth of the embrace, the sound of the protective words, and you loop that revised memory night after night until the new version feels more emotionally resonant and real to your nervous system than the original trauma. Anna did this rigorously for over 100 memories spanning the first 17 years of her life. The results she documented are staggering. Chronic health issues resolved. Her financial baseline shifted entirely. She dropped all of her daily positive affirmations because she simply didn't need them anymore. She literally became the adult she would have naturally developed into if those original traumas had never occurred. The old painful memories faded into a detached background, completely stripped of their emotional power to dictate her present choices. She fundamentally changed the blueprint her subconscious was using to build her life. But introducing the concept of revision, and the absolute power of the imagination brings up a profound ethical and moral dimension in Neville's philosophy. And this is the true weight of the system. If imagination creates reality, if your internal assumptions are constantly, actively dictating the world and the behavior of the people around you, then every judgment, every resentment, every piece of mental gossip you hold about another person is an active act of creation against them. Let that sink in for a moment. If you are constantly rehearsing how incompetent your coworker is, or how much of a narcissistic failure your ex is, according to this framework, you are not just passively observing their behavior. You are actively keeping them locked in that state within your reality. You are feeding the worst version of them with your imaginal focus. Neville is extremely uncompromising about this moral responsibility because of his biblical framework, where he equates Christ with the human imagination. The ethical stakes are ultimate. He teaches that whenever you exercise your imagination lovingly on behalf of another person, you are literally feeding and clothing the divine. But he also delivers a terrifying warning. Whenever you imagine evil against another, you are literally beating and crucifying Christ. The mandate here isn't just to manifest a better car for yourself. The mandate is to imagine nobly for others. The highest expression of this entire philosophy is using your creative power as an act of grace. And there is a beautiful, specific story in the source material of someone doing exactly this under immense emotional pressure. During the height of World War II, a woman's niece is absolutely distraught. Her husband is an officer in the Army Air Force stationed in Atlantic City and has just received devastating orders deploying him to active duty in Europe, which, in many cases, was essentially a death sentence. The niece had been desperately hoping he would be assigned as an instructor in Florida so they wouldn't be separated by an ocean and a war. The niece is weeping uncontrollably. The bouncer is saying, "The army has spoken, he is going to Europe, end of story." She goes to her aunt for comfort. The aunt intimately understands this law of assumption. She refuses to accept the orders as final. She tells her weeping niece, "Let's actualize it right now. If you were actually in Florida right now with him, what would you feel? You would feel the warm breeze. You would smell the salt air. You would push your bare toes into the sand." So the aunt and the niece sit down together in a dark room. They take off their shoes to enhance the physical sensation. And in their shared imagination, they both feel themselves transported to Florida. They feel the grit of the sand beneath their feet. They smell the sea breeze. They hear the gulls. What is paramount to understand here is the aunt's motivation. She had no personal desire to go to Florida. She wasn't trying to manifest a vacation for her own pleasure. She was utilizing her imagination, spending her creative capital, purely as a gift. She was entering the state of the wish fulfilled entirely on behalf of someone else, out of pure, unselfish love. She imagined nobly for her niece. 48 hours later, the husband receives a completely unprecedented change of orders from military command. Instead of shipping out to Europe, he is instructed to report immediately to Florida to serve as an instructor. 5 days later, the niece is on a southbound train to join him. The aunt gifted them their reality. That is the ultimate ethical realization of Neville's work. If we are all connected in this vast subconscious web, as the mystic suggests, then imagining the best for someone else, revising your concept of them to see them as healed, successful, and whole, is the highest moral act a human being can perform. We've explored the miraculous heights of this philosophy: physical healing, defying military bureaucracy, restructuring deeply ingrained childhood trauma, and the profound beauty of gifting reality to others. But as your guide on this deep dive, I have an obligation to bring you back down to earth. We have to examine the entire picture, including the shadows, before sending you off to try these techniques. Because there are serious practical cautions embedded in these texts and in the experiences of the modern practitioners. The first major danger inherent in this system is the psychological trap of ignoring physical facts to a pathological, destructive degree. But wait, hasn't the entire premise of this episode been that we must ignore the facts? The woman in the courtroom completely ignored the facts of the lawsuit. The doctor ignored the facts of his empty bank account. Neville ignored the facts of his military draft. Where is the line between mastering your reality and dangerous delusion? That is the line. The nuance lies in whether you are ignoring a physical fact to transcend it, or ignoring it because you are terrified to face the underlying psychological truth it represents. The source material warns that turning our backs completely on physical problems without understanding their root cause can be highly dangerous. There is extensive clinical evidence showing that repressed ideas and experiences become projected into the world of reality, forming our sicknesses. Sometimes a severe problem in the physical world is actually a manifestation of a deep internal issue that we need to actively face, process, and learn from, not magically erase with a visualization technique. If you are in a deeply toxic, abusive relationship, you should not close your eyes, go into sats, and imagine your partner being kind to you while you continue to endure daily abuse in the physical world. The toxic situation might be a massive screaming alarm bell from your own subconscious, telling you to finally look at your shattered self-worth and boundary issues. You need to read the warning light on the dashboard and take physical action, not put a piece of tape over the light and pretend the car is fine. Sometimes you have to engage with the difficult physical reality. Sometimes you have to seek traditional therapy to understand what your subconscious is desperately trying to communicate through the conflict you're experiencing. And there is also a very real physical warning regarding the revision technique. Anna, who successfully revised over 100 traumas, includes a massive flashing disclaimer in her work. She explicitly warns that revision is an advanced, highly stressful psychological technique. She candidly admits she made a severe mistake by attempting to revise those 100 memories in a compressed time frame of just 2.5 weeks. Doing so led to complete emotional exhaustion, severe anxiety, and actual debilitating physical symptoms. Why would imagining better memories cause physical illness? Drawing on Dr. Joe Dispenza's work, the physical body essentially acts as the hard drive of the subconscious mind. The body physically stores the chemical signature and muscular tension of old traumas. When you use revision to rapidly rewrite the psychological script, your physical nervous system has to scramble to catch up to the new reality. It requires immense energy to dismantle old neural pathways and build new ones. It needs time to integrate the new chemical baseline. If you attempt to revise too many heavy foundational traumas too quickly, your body rebels against the sudden shift in its biological reality. Anna strongly advises pacing yourself deliberately, and she recommends utilizing body-based somatic therapies like yoga, deep tissue massage, or EMDR to help the physical nervous system process and integrate the psychological changes. You are performing deep psychological surgery on yourself. You must respect the required recovery time. Most importantly, revision is absolutely not recommended for individuals who are currently in an acute emotional or psychological crisis. You need a stable baseline of inner resources to safely navigate the dismantling of your past. This is powerful, but it is not a toy. So as we begin to land the plane on this deep dive, what does all of this mean for you, the listener, today? We've covered 1930s mystical theology, the esoteric teachings of Ethiopian rabbis, the neuroscience of hypnagogic states, the evolutionary biology of the rational mind, and the radical concept of rewriting your own history. Whether you fully embrace Neville Goddard's sweeping mystical framework, the idea that your fundamental awareness is literally the creator of the universe, or whether you view all of this purely through the grounded lens of cognitive psychology, neuroplasticity, and the reticular activating system, the undeniable, actionable truth here is about your mental diet. Your internal assumptions dictate your behaviors. Your behaviors dictate your choices. Your choices dictate the trajectory of your life. If you are constantly rehearsing failure, anxiety, worst-case scenarios, and bitter resentments in your mental movie theater, you are absolutely guaranteeing that those themes will dominate your physical reality. It ultimately comes down to taking radical, uncompromising responsibility for your inner world. You can no longer claim to be a passive victim of your own wandering thoughts. So tonight, when you lie in bed and you reach that heavy, floaty state right before sleep, when the bouncer finally steps away from the door, what scene are you going to choose to loop? What blueprint are you going to hand over to the builders? To help you answer that question, I want to leave you with one final story from the text. It perfectly encapsulates the terrifying power of the undisciplined imagination. In 1898, there was a struggling American author named Morgan Robertson. He wrote a novel about a massive, luxurious ocean liner, described as the largest and most magnificent ship ever built by human hands. He wrote that the ship was filled with rich, complacent people. In his fictional narrative, he wrecked the ship on a cold April night by having it strike an iceberg in the North Atlantic. And because there weren't enough lifeboats on board, a staggering number of his fictional passengers died in the freezing water. He named his fictional, unsinkable ship the Titan. The book was published under the title Futility. He wrote this in 1898. 14 years later, a British shipping company built a physical steamer that was remarkably, almost impossibly, like the one in Robertson's novel. The fictional ship was 800 feet long. The real ship was 882 feet long. Both ships carried approximately 3,000 people. Both ships had a severe, fatal shortage of lifeboats. Both ships were proudly labeled by the press as unsinkable. And on a cold April night, the real ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and went down. The real ship, of course, was the RMS Titanic. The structural similarity defies rational explanation. Robertson thought he was just writing a piece of pulp fiction. He thought he was using his imagination for harmless entertainment, sitting alone in his room typing words on a page. But if Neville Goddard's fundamental premise is correct, if our imagination is not a passive mirror, but an active, relentless creative force that is constantly pouring objects, events, and circumstances into space-time, what future are you casually writing into existence right now? Think about that tonight, not with fear, but with the profound awareness that you are always, in every moment, either creating by default or creating by design. The machinery never stops running. The only question is whether you are the one deciding what it builds. Neville spent his entire life trying to hand you the keys to that machinery. Abdullah slammed a door in a young man's face to protect the integrity of his assumption. A bedridden woman closed her eyes and ran barefoot on a beach until her body had no choice but to agree. A grieving niece took off her shoes in a dark room and felt Florida sand beneath her feet. And 2 days later, the army changed its mind. These weren't accidents, these weren't coincidences dressed up in mystical clothing. According to this philosophy, they were the completely natural, inevitable result of consciousness doing exactly what consciousness has always done, turning the deeply felt inner world into the experienced outer one. So here is the invitation I want to leave you with. Tonight, in that drowsy twilight just before sleep takes you, don't let your mind wander into its old familiar loops of worry and rehearsed regret. Instead, deliberately choose a scene. Make it short, make it specific, make it sensory. Make it an event that could only happen after your wish has already been fulfilled. Feel the handshake, hear the congratulations, smell the sea air, touch the sand. And then, like Abdullah standing firm behind that closed door, refuse to entertain any conversation about how it's going to happen. Just loop the scene, let the bouncer sleep, and hand the blueprint to the builders. That is the power of imagination.